I'm Daniel Harrow, and what I'm about to tell you has been buried for over 160 years under brick, mud, and layers of silence thick enough to choke the truth. The kind of story towns pretend never happened. A tale fossilized beneath years of corn harvests, Sunday sermons, and friendly porch waves. The town of Heller's Edge, Ohio, was founded in 1831 by German immigrants drawn to the fertile plains east of Columbus. By 1860, it had blossomed into a tight-knit settlement of about 300 people, surrounded by woods that locals still say hum after dark. The town was known for its cobblers, its hog farmers, and the sweet iron tang of the creek that ran through it. A place with no jail, no judge, no need for locks. But that summer, something unnatural began to rot beneath the dirt. And it all started, at least officially, with a sinkhole behind the old Geiger house. A soft dip in the grass that collapsed overnight, revealing a round wooden hatch sealed tight with rusted iron rings. Children discovered it first. They thought it was a well. When the township surveyor cracked it open, the air that burst out smelled of iron and vinegar and something worse, something warm and rotten despite the cool soil. It wasn't a well, it was a room. I was drawn to the case over a century later in 2023, while researching unclassified documents for a series on missing persons prior to national registration laws. I found something that didn't belong in the archives. A faded coroner's ledger with yellowed pages, stamped 1861, never catalogued. On page 42, a simple, blunt entry, child remains, partial, skull fragment embedded in animal jaw, non-human, ritual suspected. Ritual suspected. It was filed under a dead judge's name, with no follow-up. The name of the property, Geiger Farmstead. I went to Heller's Edge that October. The town is still there. Still has one diner, still no jail. No one under 60 remembers anything, at least not publicly. But the bartender at Wyatt's Tavern was the first to say it out loud, over a warm bourbon and averted eyes. "You're looking into the trapdoor house." I asked if it was a story, some local myth. He shook his head. "Ain't no story. We had pigs in the corners, not live, not for food." That phrase would echo again and again, like some coded memory everyone shared but no one unpacked. They'd say, "Ask about the pigs in the corners," or "Mind the basement, it remembers," or sometimes just, "Don't go looking under the brick." I found the property eventually. The Geiger homestead is long gone. Burned down in 1892, they said, after a lightning strike. But the basement remains, covered in moss, ringed with charred stone. Half collapsed but still breathing in its own way. And on that first day, before I even entered, I saw something I wasn't prepared for. A pig skull nailed into a tree, clean, bleached, placed at eye level. No markings, no initials, no explanation. I took a picture. My phone shut off. This wasn't just an old crime. It wasn't just a murder. It was a house built on obedience, punishment, and something no one had the words to name. But they knew it. You could see it in their eyes when you asked about the Geigers, especially about August and Miriam, because they weren't just farmers. They were good people, respected, pious, and sometimes the most trusted people are the ones we should have feared most. August and Miriam Geiger were the type of couple that towns like Heller's Edge pointed to with pride. If you visit the county records office, their names are still etched into the founding donation logs. August, providing land for the first schoolhouse, Miriam stitching together uniforms for the town's Civil War volunteers. To the people of 1860, they were a model of virtue and generosity. August was a second-generation German immigrant, tall, lean, with sun-hardened hands and a preacher's voice. He led morning prayers in the chapel when the pastor fell ill and frequently read scripture aloud in the fields, claiming the corn grew straighter when blessed. Miriam, his wife, was quieter but just as revered. A midwife, a healer. She had this reputation for knowing what a body needed, even before a person did. Women in labor swore she whispered scripture as they pushed. She never lost a child, they said, until she did. They lived in a 2-story stone house with high windows and red shutters, painted yearly without fail. The fields behind it held wheat, barley, and a modest number of hogs, penned and rotated with care. Visitors remarked how orderly the place was. Not a cobweb to be found, according to one journal entry from a visiting chaplain in 1857. And Miriam serves coffee without tremble, though there is sadness in her eyes when she speaks of their first daughter, passed at birth. And that daughter, her name was Anna, was buried behind the house under a white cross carved with the words, "God taketh what he loveth most." A neighbor told me Anna's grave was always fresh with flowers, regardless of the season. It was Miriam's way, but there was something else too, and this came from the testimonies I uncovered in a century-old diary written by Elizabeth Murch, a schoolteacher who boarded nearby. She wrote this: "The Geiger children do not play with the others. August says their minds must not be polluted. I saw the oldest, Samuel, standing in the rain yesterday, arms out like Christ, unmoving for near an hour. I called to him. He did not answer. There were 5 children in all, according to the census records, but only 3 were ever seen by neighbors. That fact wouldn't seem suspicious on its own in an era of high child mortality. But then you read further and you begin to see cracks. Samuel, Ruth, and Elias, those were the visible ones. Always in linen, always polite. Their hair was cut identically, bowl-shaped and blunt. The younger 2, names unknown, were never listed on any church rolls, and no one I spoke to could remember them being baptized. That wasn't the only oddity. Several neighbors recalled Miriam walking alone through the woods just after sundown, always barefoot, always carrying a wicker basket. One woman swore she heard the sound of low humming, like a lullaby, echoing through the trees long after Miriam had passed. She was praying, another said, to God, or something she thought was him. I tracked down a distant descendant of the Murch family, an old man named Elijah, who still had the diaries. When I asked him if he believed the rumors about the Geigers, he just said, "They fed people, tended to births, helped bury our dead." "But you tell me, mister, how many midwives bury their own stillborn girl and then keep adding rooms to the cellar every winter after?" I found a sketch of the original property layout in an old zoning map from 1859. The main floor was simple enough, but the basement had 3 levels. The third one wasn't official. It was hand-drawn in charcoal, added in after the blueprint was archived. Beneath the second basement level, someone had scrawled a word next to a crude square: nursery. Not nursery. Nursery, with an IE. When I asked Elijah if he ever saw the basement, he shook his head. "No one ever did," he said. "But my great-grandma said she heard screams in that house at night. Not the pained kind, the joyful kind. Like children laughing, but wrong. Like they were taught to laugh at the wrong things." And then he said the phrase again. "The pigs were always in the corners." I asked what he meant. He didn't answer. He just closed the diary, handed it back to me and whispered, "You don't dig too deep, son. That dirt remembers." The first time I truly felt the gravity of what was hidden beneath the Geiger house wasn't in the dusty archives or the crumbling property lines. It was in a memory retold by a woman who never set foot inside. Her name was Miriam Loughlin, no relation to the original Geiger matriarch, though that fact seemed to unsettle her more than it should have. Her grandmother, Agnes Loughlin, had lived 2 fields over from the Geiger farm in 1858. Miriam had inherited a bundle of Agnes's journals, worn leather, brittle pages, ink faded to the color of old blood. When I told her why I'd come to Hella's Edge, she didn't hesitate. She pulled the journal from a wooden trunk and flipped to a page marked with dried yarrow. October 11th, 1858. They don't eat the pigs. August buries them in 4 corners of the field. Every time, same ritual. The children help. The littlest one sobbed when the sow bled out. August made him kneel in it until the crying stopped. I asked Miriam what she thought it meant. "People talk about sin like it's personal," she said. "But August, he treated it like it was a thing, like a weed in the field that had to be uprooted. Maybe he thought the pigs absorbed it. Maybe he thought burying them could trap it." There were other entries too, some so disturbing I hesitated to read them out loud. One detailed how Miriam Geiger had come by on the 3rd Tuesday of every month with purity salve and a satchel of dried herbs. She claimed it warded off the red rot that plagued girls before marriage. She administered it herself. In modern terms, it was salve made from pig fat, camphor, and, according to a passing line, ashes from the mouth. A few neighbors described odd noises at night, moaning, grunting, even what they swore were animal cries, but no one ever reported it. Hella's Edge wasn't a town for accusations. It was a town for prayers and unspoken shame. Then there was the matter of the eldest child, Samuel. His teacher, Miss Elvira Dodd, kept a meticulous attendance book. I found it tucked in the back of the Hella Historical Society under an old hymn book. Samuel was listed as present every day for 3 years straight, except for 1 week in March of 1859. The note beside those dates read simply, "Sent to the root cellar." That wasn't school punishment. That was home punishment. Another former resident, 92-year-old Thomas Greeley, recalled what his father once whispered to him about the Geiger children. They weren't born wrong. They were trained that way. Trained to hurt in silence, to smile when it burned. When one of them flinched at sunlight, Miriam said it was God purifying his flesh. Like sun was judgment itself. No one had seen Ruth Geiger in church for nearly a year before the house burned down, but they had heard her. Testimonies from the time mentioned strange singing late at night, carried on the wind, a dirge, some said. Others claimed it was a lullaby, always the same rhythm, always in a language no one recognized. And in the center of all these accounts, unmistakable and consistent, was the image of pigs. Pig skulls mounted on wooden stakes, pig bones crushed into paste, pig squeals echoing long after the animals were supposed to be gone. Some thought it was superstition, some claimed it was medicinal. But I would later find evidence that the Geigers believed pigs held something: sin, sickness, maybe even souls. A letter from a traveling pastor to his wife, dated July 1860, mentioned a visit to the Geiger farm. He described the hospitality as exemplary, but noted something strange. They offered me stew, rich and dark. It tasted of sage and iron. I asked after the recipe. Miriam only smiled and said, "All sin must return to the soil." The pastor left before dawn. 3 months later, the trapdoor behind the house collapsed, and what they found beneath, what the town buried in a flurry of denial, would take over a century to come to light. But back then, it started with whispers, with little signs, like how Ruth wore gloves in the summer, or how no child who entered the Geiger house ever came back with the same look in their eyes, or how beneath the floorboards the pigs kept squealing even after the pen stood empty. By the winter of 1859, the Geigers had begun to pull away from the town that once held them up as moral pillars. Slowly at first, missed church services, declining dinner invitations, but with increasing certainty, like a curtain being drawn between their world and everyone else's. Samuel stopped attending school altogether. Ruth had not been seen in town since midsummer, and Elias, the youngest of the known 3, was said to roam the fields alone, muttering into cupped hands. One neighbor, Lillian Hartley, recounted seeing him crouched in a ditch outside their property at dawn, speaking softly to something no one else could see. When she called out to him, he turned slowly and said, "They don't like you looking." Children who played near the Geiger property began coming home pale, tearful, or scratched, claiming they'd seen faces in the barn slats or heard someone calling their names from under the ground. Parents chalked it up to nerves or imagination. But more than one family quietly forbade their children from playing near the fence line after that. The Geigers' farm, once pristine, began to change too. Vines overgrew the front gate. Windows remained shuttered even during daylight hours. The red paint on the shutters faded to rust, and no one repainted it for the first time in nearly a decade. Despite the decay, something new was being built underground. Several witnesses described the arrival of carts just before moonrise, covered in thick brown cloth, always driven by August himself. No one knew where they came from or what they carried, but the sound, God, the sound of metal grinding against stone echoed long into the night. He was digging, that much is clear, expanding something that already lived beneath the house. One evening, Miss Elvira Dodd, the schoolteacher, came to deliver a lesson plan to Miriam, an old habit they'd kept up despite the children's withdrawal from school. Miriam answered the door without her usual poise. Her hands were raw and wrapped in gauze. Her dress was damp at the hem. Elvira noted the overwhelming stench, coppery and sweet, almost like spoiled molasses. She offered to return another time, but Miriam only said, "No, please. You should come in, just for a moment." Elvira stepped into the parlor and immediately noticed the walls had been stripped bare. The family's religious paintings were gone, replaced by crude symbols etched into the plaster, spirals, interlocking teeth, a single phrase scrawled repeatedly in black ash: "Clean the corners, feed the floor." When Elvira asked about the phrase, Miriam gave her a hollow look and said, "The children write what they remember." That was the last time anyone in town saw the inside of the Geiger house. Around the same time, August began visiting the apothecary under false pretenses, asking for increasing quantities of camphor, belladonna, and powdered bone meal. The shopkeeper, a man named Wesley Dunn, became uneasy and refused to sell him more. August calmly laid a pig's jawbone on the counter and walked out without another word. It was nailed to the shop's front door the next morning. There were attempts to intervene. A local reverend wrote a letter to the township elders, urging them to check on the Geiger children. He cited the strange behavior, the withdrawal, the scent that lingered in the fields, but the elders declined to act. "August is a man of God," they said, "and Miriam's hands have delivered half this town." No one wanted to believe something had curdled behind those red shutters, but some knew. Mrs. Lillian Hartley, she of the ditch sighting, later confided in her diary that she followed Miriam one night through the woods. From a distance, she saw her kneeling beside a stone well, chanting. She wore a child's smock over her dress, not hers, not her size. She was feeding something into the water, clumps of hair torn from a scalp. The town's tolerance cracked further when a fourth child was spotted, just once. A little girl, pale and barefoot, standing behind a curtain in the upstairs window of the Geiger house. No one recognized her. She didn't match the known children. And when neighbors returned the next day to ask after her, Miriam claimed no such child existed. The curtains stayed drawn after that. Within weeks, livestock began disappearing from nearby farms. But what was most disturbing wasn't the absence. It was what was left behind. Blood circles, bones arranged in star-like shapes, pig teeth embedded in tree trunks. And in every case, every single case, these remnants pointed toward the Geiger land. The townsfolk began whispering that whatever lived beneath that house had begun to hunger. Not for food, for offerings, for obedience. And the Geigers, God help them, were all too willing to obey. The first undeniable crack in the wall of silence came with a scream, wet and raw, slicing through the mist-thick morning air on March the 2nd, 1860. It was Elias Geiger. A man named Abner Coyle, a pig trader from Belleville, had taken his cart along the Old West Road, a route that skirted the edge of the Geiger property. He swore in his written account that he wasn't looking for trouble. But as he passed the orchard, he heard a sound that made his horses rear up and nearly buck him. He followed the scream to the split-rail fence line and found Elias, naked, bleeding from his knees and elbows, his mouth coated in dirt. The boy was clawing at the ground near the apple tree roots. He said something again and again, through gasps and sobs. "They buried her in the corner. The corner. I didn't mean to watch. I didn't mean to." Abner tried to lift him, but Elias thrashed and bit him hard enough to draw blood. When two other farmers arrived minutes later, Elias had curled into a tight ball under the tree, whispering, "The pig saw, the pig told." They carried him to town. Miriam did not come to claim him. August did, but not until nightfall. And when he arrived, he didn't ask where Elias was. He only asked who had dug where they oughtn't. The town physician, Dr. Raymond Lyle, examined Elias that same afternoon. His notes, recovered in 1912 by a medical historian, tell a story more chilling than most are willing to accept. Lacerations to scalp, wrists, and left thigh. Circular scarring on abdomen, too precise for natural wound. Branding, 4 teeth marks in upper back. Not human. Boy trembles at light, Eyes fixate on dark corners of the room. When asked about home, he begins humming and rocking, a song with no discernible melody, high, keening tone, identical to chant reported by Miss Dodd in October. The doctor contacted the sheriff, but Heller's Edge had no real law enforcement, just a few old men with pistols and more worries about corn blight than criminal neglect. They agreed to question the family. When the constable arrived at the Geiger farm that evening, no one answered the door. The shutters were closed. The yard was silent, but the air around the house smelled off. Burnt hair and wet iron. He knocked, then pounded, and finally, in frustration, he circled to the rear of the house where he saw it. A child, standing in the field. Not Ruth, not Samuel, not Elias. This child was smaller. She wore a burlap dress soaked to the hem. Her head was shaved. Her skin was so pale, it nearly reflected moonlight. The constable called out. She stared at him, then lifted her hand and pointed to the basement window, then vanished. It wasn't until the following morning that August arrived in town with a note from Miriam, written in tight, slanted script on yellowed paper. Elias is under a purification trial. No further contact is permitted until his spirit has ceased its trembling. The corners will be fed. The bones will be aligned. We ask for no interference. This is our house. Dr. Lyle wasn't satisfied. He'd served with Union medics during the skirmishes in Kentucky. He knew what trauma looked like. This wasn't punishment. It was ritual, abuse wrapped in scripture. He appealed to the township again. But by then, the town was folding in on itself. Half the population wanted to let the Geigers be. The other half whispered about strange lights seen flickering beneath the farmhouse, about how the pigs had all gone quiet, completely silent. No grunts, no squeals, nothing. And then there was the smell, a thick, sour stench that hung around the west fields like spoiled vinegar, flies in winter, dirt that bled when you dug too deep. Still, no official action was taken, so Dr. Lyle did the only thing he could. He wrote a letter, not to the town, but to a colleague in Columbus, a man named Willard Finch, who ran a small reform school and had a particular interest in domestic sadism. Lyle included copies of his notes, sketches of Elias's wounds, and a final line scrawled in desperation, "This child is being broken in ways I cannot name. If someone doesn't come, there will be more than pigs buried in those corners." It would take weeks for Finch to respond, and by then it was too late for Elias. Because 3 days after he was released back into his family's care, he disappeared. When asked, Miriam simply said, "The floor accepted him." The trapdoor behind the house collapsed 6 weeks later. The boards rotted through overnight, and underneath they found the first skull, not human, not quite animal, jaw like a boar, cranium like a child, and carved across the crown in seared flesh was a single phrase: "Feed the floor, clean the sin." When the trapdoor collapsed behind the Geiger house, and that thing, half skull, half omen, was pulled from the dirt, the town of Heller's Edge did what it had always done best. It looked the other way. The finding was quietly labeled "Animal Remains" by a county assessor who wasn't a coroner, wasn't trained, and left before sundown. No formal dig, no report filed. The skull was placed in a canvas sack and buried in a ditch just beyond the fence line, as if ignoring it could make it disappear. But not everyone forgot. Dr. Raymond Lyle was not a man easily shaken, and yet something in that dirt had unsettled him so profoundly he stopped sleeping in his home. He rented a room above the apothecary and began staying up at night, scouring through his notes on Elias Geiger. He redrew the scar patterns. He reanalyzed the bite marks. He consulted books on pagan purification rituals, folk medicine, and early European blood rites. And then, without fanfare, he went to the sheriff's office. He demanded a full investigation. Sheriff Tolliver, a man as old as the hills and twice as cracked, sighed through his mustache and looked out the window for a long time before saying, "You're a good man, Doc, but this town buries what it don't want to face. That's the order of things, always has been." Lyle left without another word, but he didn't stop. He wrote to Willard Finch again. this time with photographs, faded, grainy images of the trapdoor collapse, of the animal child's skull, and of the symbol found carved into the underside of the trapdoor itself, a crude spiral of inward-facing teeth. He sent these along with one sentence: "This is not isolated. The children are not accounted for, and there are more rooms underground than there are above." Finch responded immediately. He promised to travel to Heller's Edge himself within the month. But before he could arrive, someone else tried to raise the alarm. Her name was Martha Reed, 19, a laundress who delivered fresh linens to the Geigers every other Thursday. She'd been working for them since she was 15, mostly in silence. Miriam liked it that way, no questions, no talk, just folded sheets and Castile soap. But on March 29th, 1860, Martha broke that silence. She came into the town square screaming. They found her barefoot, her arms scratched raw, her apron soaked in urine. She collapsed on the cobblestone steps of the church and shouted one phrase again and again. She was in the wall. Her hands were still moving. It took nearly an hour to calm her. She refused to return home. She refused to be touched. When the pastor came to sit beside her, she whispered what she saw inside the Geiger house. She'd gone down to the root cellar to collect an empty washtub. Miriam had told her to mind the path and not stray from the first staircase, but the door at the bottom was open, and something pulled her forward. Martha swore she heard a voice, soft and musical, coming from the far corner of the cellar. It said her name, over and over, like a lullaby. When she stepped into the dark, her foot hit something soft, something warm. She lit a match. What she saw was not a washtub. It was a wall, freshly bricked, except one brick was loose, and behind it, a girl's face, barely visible. Her eyes were open, her fingers twitched against the mortar as if trying to scratch free. Martha ran. She didn't stop running until the town square, and by then, no one could tell whether what she'd seen was real or some half-born hallucination. The sheriff refused to act on her testimony. "She's hysterical," he said. "Probably drank vinegar tincture." But Martha never worked again. She never entered another cellar. And 3 months later, she was committed to the Ohio State Lunatic Asylum in Columbus after she was found digging in her garden with her fingernails, whispering the words, "Corners aren't safe. They see, they listen." Still, no one returned to the Geiger house. No warrants, no inspections, no clergy. But the signs worsened. The fields behind the farm stopped growing altogether. Corn turned black and twisted. Barley came up in clumps of tangled stalks like human hair. And the pigs, those that remained, grew bloated and aggressive. One was found in the schoolyard, butchered and posed in a circle of feathers and teeth. Another was nailed to a church door with its eyes removed and stitched back into its belly. In response, the town elders issued a final statement. "The Geigers are dealing with personal grief and must be left in peace. Let the Lord judge." But the Lord wasn't the only one watching. A child had been seen again, not Samuel, not Ruth, and not Elias. This girl had teeth that didn't match her face, and she was walking barefoot in the rain, smiling. By mid-spring of 1860, Heller's Edge had become a town divided, not politically, not over land or law, but along a fault line too strange for language. There were those who still brought their ailments to Miriam Geiger, still asked August for blessings on their fields. They refused to believe anything wicked could fester in a house that had buried so many of their dead, baptized so many of their young. And then there were the watchers, those who stopped speaking at dusk, who boarded up windows that faced west, who told their children never, under any circumstance, to walk alone near the Geiger property. They didn't speak openly, but their silence was a warning and a prayer. It was into this suffocating quiet that Willard Finch finally arrived. He came in June, a week before the summer solstice, stepping off a horse-drawn coach with a leather case and a thin silver crucifix under his vest. A reformist, an educator, and by all accounts, a deeply rational man. But what he found in Heller's Edge cracked the edges of his logic. He met first with Dr. Lyle, who presented every page of his notes: Elias's wounds, the animal child's skull, the scream Martha Reed heard from behind the brick. He walked Finch to the field where the pigs had once been buried, pointing to the 4 shallow dips in the earth that had never quite settled, even after heavy rain. Finch took notes, but what drew his attention most wasn't in the soil, it was in the town's memory. He began conducting interviews, quiet ones, gathering testimonies from those who'd seen the extra children, the ones never baptized, the ones who never spoke. He heard the same patterns again and again. They don't blink enough. Their teeth are too sharp. They only move when August isn't looking. He asked about Ruth and Samuel. No one had seen Ruth in a year. Samuel was last seen standing by the barn, still as stone, staring into nothing. And then there were the corners. Nearly every person Finch spoke to mentioned them. Corners in the cellar, corners in the church, even corners in their own homes. Dark spaces that seemed to hold breath, that grew colder by the day. One girl claimed her dolls disappeared unless she placed them in circles. A woman said her pantry door opened every night unless she salted the floor. Finch was skeptical until he visited the Geiger farm himself. It was late afternoon. The air was warm and yellow with dust. August met him at the front door with calm, unblinking eyes and the Bible held against his chest. The two men spoke for nearly an hour. We have no record of what was said, but we know what Finch wrote afterward. August believes sin is a sickness of geometry, that evil hides where angles meet. He says the body stores it, but the body can't contain it, so it spills into the soil, into the walls, into the pigs. He says Miriam hears it breathing when she sleeps. Finch asked to see the basement. August refused. When Finch pressed, August placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You don't enter what you're not willing to feed." Finch left, but he was not deterred. That night, he returned, alone. He brought no lantern, no guide, but he carried the blueprint of the house in his mind, the maps he'd drawn from zoning records and old farm ledgers. He knew about the 3 basement levels. He knew about the hand-sketched word, nursery. And he brought with him something else, a carpenter's square. He marked every corner of the root cellar with chalk. Nothing happened at first. Then, one by one, the marks vanished, as if licked away. He heard something breathing behind the wall, something rhythmic, like a child sleeping beside a beast that never stopped gnawing. He left that night with more questions than answers, but he'd seen enough. He returned to town and wrote a letter, not to a friend, not to a colleague, but to the governor's office. He requested a state investigation. He cited child endangerment, ritual abuse, and unlawful imprisonment. He warned them of structures beneath the Geiger property which appear not to have been built with human habitation in mind. He hand-delivered the letter to the nearest postmaster, but it never arrived, because that night the postmaster's home burned down. No other house caught fire, no wind that night, no lightning. The fire started in the corners of his living room. And in the morning, when the embers cooled, investigators found something strange. A pig's skull, untouched by flame, sitting in the ash. Its mouth was open, and inside it, folded neatly like a note passed in church, was Willard Finch's letter, unburnt. Someone had returned it. Someone who never left the Geiger house. I was 6 weeks into the investigation, living out of the attic above the old chapel, when I found the Geiger ledger. It was stored in a warped cedar box at the back of the Heller Historical Society, a room thick with dust and forgetting. No one had touched the box in years. I opened it expecting ledgers of harvest yields, maybe inventories of livestock sales. What I found instead was a journal, August's. It wasn't labeled, no signature, but the handwriting matched his farm records. The entries were methodical, dated in neat rows, each one beginning with a phrase repeated like ritual. Purification begins where flesh meets fear. The entries were cold, mechanical, not emotional confessions, but logs, documentation. He referred to the children not by name, but by number. Child 1, female, obedient, prone to trembling. Child 2, male, withdraws during heat, reluctant to feed. Child 3, female, speaks of corners, must be isolated. And then this. Child 5 has taken well to the trial. She sleeps beneath the teeth. She smiles even when the song begins. There were no names beyond those notes. No mention of Ruth, Samuel, or Elias. Just children catalogued like livestock. There were 8 entries in total, but census records only listed 5. When I brought the journal to Dr. Lyle, he turned pale. He'd long suspected there were unregistered children, possibly adopted or trafficked, but this confirmed it. Not just missing children, but undocumented lives, ghosts that no one had ever seen above ground. We traced the dates in the journal against the town's hospital logs, school attendance, even burial records. That's when we noticed the gaps. Each time a child was logged in August's book, a corresponding child had disappeared from the community, not always from Heller's Edge, sometimes from surrounding villages, 1 from Belleville, 2 from as far as Mansfield, but always the same pattern. A family reported a missing child, no follow-up, and weeks later, a delivery of hogs from Geiger Farm to the same village, always salted, always smoked, always cheaper than market value. Finch's notes corroborated what we feared. In his final journal entry before the fire that destroyed the postmaster's house, he described a smell coming from the Geiger smokehouse, unlike any he'd ever encountered. There is pork, but something else too, a sweetness. A rot that hums beneath the skin. The deeper we dug, the worse it got. The farm had been receiving donations, anonymous, unrecorded, all in cash, through a false front, the West Corner Mission, a charitable orphanage that existed only on paper. I found its name listed in a tithing ledger from 1856. Beside it a scrawled note, "For Miriam's little ones, may they never hunger." The note was signed with a symbol, a spiral made of interlocking teeth. I began seeing that symbol everywhere, in the margins of the Geiger Journal, etched faintly into the old chapel's pulpit, carved into the bark of a tree behind the schoolhouse, so subtle it looked like insect damage until you stared too long. They weren't just hiding abuse. They were practicing something, perfecting it, and they had help. From whom? That part I still don't know, but I found a letter dated February 1860 from a magistrate in Columbus, addressed to A.G. It was folded among the Geiger receipts, its contents chilling. "Your methods remain unorthodox, but your results are compelling. The temperament of the female marked number 3 has improved under observation. Please continue with the water fasting. Send marrow samples when complete. The brethren await the corners." The brethren, they knew. Whoever they were, they knew what the Geigers were doing. Maybe they encouraged it. Maybe they were funding it. And what did they mean by the corners? I remembered what Elias said, what he whispered after digging in the orchard. They buried her in the corner. I didn't mean to watch. And Martha Reed, clawing her own garden into a frenzy, muttering, "Corners aren't safe. They see, they listen." What if the corners weren't just symbolic? What if they were structural? I returned to the ruins of the house. This time, I brought ground-penetrating radar and 2 volunteers from the State Historical Survey. It was late. The air was wet with coming rain. We scanned the north field first, then the root cellar. That's where we found it. 4 sealed enclosures, shallow, equidistant, each set into the corners of the basement foundation, each perfectly square. Inside, animal remains, mostly, except one. In the northeast corner, beneath 12 inches of lime and ash, we found a child's shoe, still intact, leather, buckled, and beside it, a tiny hand bone, no larger than a bird's wing. Each corner had held something, not pigs, children, always one per corner, and always buried in silence. The pattern was clear now. The Geigers were not working alone. They were part of something older, something geometrically devout, something that believed pain aligned the soul and corners concentrated it. August wrote once, "The floor accepts only when the corners are full. When the bones whisper back, we know the cleansing has begun." This wasn't a family cult. This was a ritual engine, and the fuel had always been the same. Bone, blood, and children who no one remembered until it was too late. I didn't sleep for days after finding that bone. Not because of the horror, though there was plenty of that, but because of what I knew came next. If the Geigers weren't acting alone, if this thing was structured, if it had rules and rituals and steps, then somewhere, somehow there would be doctrine, a belief system, something written, something kept. I found it on the 12th day after the dig, hidden in the one place no one had thought to look, inside the chapel's cornerstone. The building had been gutted years ago, converted to a seed supply depot, but the original foundations still held. I noticed a strange brick, slightly discolored on the northeast corner of the altar base. I pried it loose with a crowbar. Inside was a hollowed cavity, dry, dustless, and inside that, wrapped in wax cloth and bound with a pig's tail, was the Concord of Angles, a handwritten manuscript, 79 pages, bound in hide. The opening page read, "To cleanse a soul, it must be reduced. To reduce, it must be bent. The world bends where corners meet, and so too must the flesh." It was signed only with a single spiral of teeth. What followed was not metaphor, it was doctrine. It outlined steps, rites, prayers to be recited before the shaping. It described 4 essential phases: preparation, isolation, submission, and binding. Each phase had precise requirements, and each involved a child. Under preparation, the text dictated that the subject must be taken before age 10. No bloodline preference. Purity mattered more than relation. The child must be kept alone in a room with 4 corners. No curves, no shadows. Corners were sacred. Corners heard. Under isolation, the child was denied name, voice, and eye contact for 1 full season. They were to eat only what was offered in the corners, usually pork fat, root mash, and well water. Under submission, there was the branding, a spiral of teeth, either carved or burned, onto the chest, forehead, or base of the spine. This marked the child as recognized by what the manuscript called the mouth beneath, but it was the final phase, binding, that turned my stomach inside out. Once the spirit fractures and accepts silence, the body is fed to the floor in sections. The heart, the tongue, and the eyes must be separated. Only then does the corner fill. Only then does the foundation strengthen. The corners weren't symbolic. They were hungry. These people, the Geigers and whoever they answered to, believed the corners of every room were spiritual apertures, mouths waiting to be fed. And the floor was the altar, the place where bones fed back their silence. There were pages filled with hand-drawn schematics, floor plans of cellars, barns, even schools, with notations in the margins like, "This one too wide," "Corner lost strength," "Better if crying begins before first meal," "North wall receives best blood." One diagram was of a nursery, small, square, stone, titled simply, "Ruth's Place." I found Ruth's name twice more, buried deep in the text. She was described not as a daughter, but as she who listens, a child supposedly born in silence and capable of hearing what others fear. There was a passage that suggested Miriam believed Ruth could communicate with what lived beneath the house, that she didn't just follow the rituals, she understood them. And then, this note scrawled by a different hand, ink thicker and uneven: "Ruth no longer eats. She says the mouth has asked for a feast. She says the pigs are not enough. She says the next must have a name." That line chilled me, because it meant the rituals were escalating. The sacrifices had moved beyond the nameless, the unregistered. Now they wanted the known, the baptized, the town's children. Was that the plan all along? A slow evolution from secrecy to integration, from hiding in basements to building beliefs into every room of the community. I found a side note referencing a plan to place cornerwood sigils in the church and schoolhouse. Glyphs hidden behind the plaster, carved into beams, so subtle they would be mistaken for knots or flaws in the wood. They wanted to make the entire town an altar. And the corners? They were mouths waiting to open. It made me think about something Martha Reed said in her second confinement report, before she lost her ability to speak. "They watch us from where we don't sweep. The unswept corners, the ones we forget, where cobwebs cling, where light doesn't reach. That's where the mouth waited, where the bones whispered, where Ruth smiled." One of the last pages in the Concord of Angles contained a short chant, written phonetically, possibly a bastardization of Latin and early German: "Vas rum tum est, cornua satur, os aperiat, filius tectus." Roughly translated, "The vessel is ready, the corners are full, The mouth opens. The child is hidden. The final phrase was underlined, and beneath it, scrawled in a frantic, jagged hand, one final sentence: "She has gone below, and she will never come back alone." They came on July 13th, 1860. 6 men from the state, sent quietly under the guise of agricultural inspection. But they weren't farmers, and they didn't ask about wheat or swine. They were armed. Among them was Willard Finch. Burned scars still blotched the back of his hands from the postmaster's fire. He carried with him a copy of the Concord of Angles, tucked into a satchel wrapped in salt cloth and cord. The raid began just before dawn. No announcement, no warrant. They didn't knock. They went straight to the cellar. Miriam Geiger opened the door with a smile. Witnesses said she looked younger than she should have. Skin stretched too tight, teeth too white. She welcomed them in, offered black tea and bone broth. When they declined, she said simply, "You're too late. The floor is already full." August wasn't home, or so they thought. They found him in the 3rd basement, naked, curled into a corner, muttering scripture backward. What they uncovered in those lower levels defied reason. Finch's report, only recovered a century later, documented it in dry, bureaucratic prose, but no amount of formality could blunt what they found. Level 1 was storage, normal enough. Pickling jars, root vegetables, salted meat, but the walls were strange, covered in soot, with symbols carved beneath layers of wax. Level 2 was colder, much colder. Despite the summer heat, it felt like autumn inside. 4 rooms, 1 in each corner. Each room had a drain in the center. Each room had shackles. Finch described it as a symmetry of suffering. One of the inspectors vomited. Level 3 was behind a door made of bone, human femurs, dozens of them, wired together. When they forced it open, they found the nursery. A square chamber, 7 feet by 7 feet, made entirely of stone. The floor sloped slightly to the center, where a small pit had been carved, lined with teeth, real teeth. Inside that pit, they found her, Ruth, alive. She was kneeling, hands folded, smiling. Her eyes were cloudy but focused. She whispered as they approached. One of the inspectors said it sounded like humming through a throat full of broken glass. When they touched her, she screamed, but not in fear, in joy. Because behind her, the wall cracked, and from the darkness beyond it, something moved. A hand, no, more like a limb, boneless, wet, covered in coarse black hair and small childlike fingers along the wrist. They pulled Ruth out, and then they sealed the chamber with salt, with stone, with nails hammered through scripture. Miriam didn't resist. She sat in the parlor drinking tea until they dragged her out. She was singing a lullaby, something in German. The pigs were gone. Everyone. Only the skulls remained, nailed into the corners of each room, just as Martha Reed had said, each with words carved into the forehead. Here I ate, here I saw, here I fed the silence. The house was condemned that very day. The town gathered to watch it burn, not by order, by instinct. They poured oil, they lit torches, they screamed prayers into the night. Some say they saw shadows twisting in the smoke, limbs and smiles and spiral mouths. No one asked questions. No one spoke Ruth's name again. But the fire didn't reach the foundation. The stone basement survived, buried under ash and denial, waiting. In Finch's final report, sealed and filed under a false case number, he wrote this: "There is geometry to evil. It does not scatter. It arranges, 4 corners, 1 mouth. The child was not the origin. She was the door." Miriam was taken to an asylum in Columbus. She never spoke again. August died 2 weeks after the raid, choked on his own tongue. And Ruth? She vanished from state custody. No one knows how. One guard claimed the corner of her cell was open when he arrived. Not broken, just missing, like it had never been built. He found a pig's skull on his bed that night, and inside it, a single tooth, human, baby-sized. They sealed the cellar beneath the Geiger house with stone and salt, but no official map was drawn, no monument, no warning. The town went on. But some of the oldest residents still say, on hot nights, when the air hangs heavy with vinegar and blood, if you lean too close to the corners of your room, you'll hear her. smiling, waiting. The aftermath was a slow unraveling, less like a clean wound and more like rot spreading beneath painted walls. Officially, the Geiger case was labeled a ritualistic domestic disturbance, a term so anemic it bled shame instead of justice. The state sent no press release, no public trial, just paperwork shuffled into locked drawers. But survivors remember, Dr. Raymond Lyle left Heller's Edge within days of the raid. He never practiced again. His final note, scribbled into the margin of a medical textbook, read, "I looked into the corners of that house. What I saw there looked back, and it knew my name." Miriam Geiger remained in the Columbus Asylum for another 13 years. The reports from her physicians are clinical, restrained. But tucked in the back of one file, I found a nurse's personal account. She had cared for Miriam during her first winter at the institution. She sings to herself when it rains, always the same song, in German. But when I asked a translator, he said it didn't match any dialect. She calls it the cradle song of the corners. I once caught her feeding breadcrumbs into the corner of her room. When I asked why, she whispered, "They get lonely without bones." In 1873, Miriam stopped speaking altogether. She died the following year during an unusually hot summer, curled on the floor of her cell, arms outstretched like a child mid-prayer. Her mouth was packed with cotton, and inside that cotton they found 4 human teeth, one from a child under 5, 1 molar, 2 canines filed to points. August was buried in an unmarked grave. No ceremony, no eulogy. Locals swore they heard a squealing sound beneath the earth during the burial. The gravedigger quit that same day. The children, that part is harder. Samuel was never found. Not in the house, not in the woods, not in any institution. He simply vanished. Some say he was the first to be taken beneath. Others believe he escaped and lives hidden in the records under a new name. But I found no paper trail, no fingerprint, no breath. Elias's story is murkier. His disappearance occurred 2 weeks before the raid. But years later, 1911, a janitor at the Cleveland Municipal Archives filed a complaint that someone was living in the sub-basement. When staff checked, they found symbols etched into the walls, spirals, teeth, and in the corner a pile of bones, finger bones, 12 of them, each perfectly cleaned, no sign of Elias. And Ruth became the echo. Unconfirmed sightings were reported well into the early 1900s. A girl seen staring into the corner of a barn. A young woman seated backward in a church pew, humming tunelessly, always barefoot, always pale, always gone before she could be reached. In 1926, a newspaper in Indiana reported that 2 children went missing from a schoolhouse in Boone County. The only clue left behind was a single pig's skull placed in the center of the classroom. A note was found, tucked inside the teacher's desk. The mouth opens, the floor remembers, and the corners are never empty. The story was buried within days. Over time, the families of Heller's Edge began moving away. The land was sold, resold, then left to rot. The fields overgrew, the trees thickened, and the foundation of the Geiger house slowly disappeared beneath ivy, moss, and superstition. But survivors passed down stories, some in whispers, others in fragments. One woman, Anna Kirkland, descended from the Laughlin line, shared her memory before she died in 1983. "My grandmother never let us sleep in rooms with square corners. She'd hammer a piece of wood into each one, said if we slept in right angles, they could reach us again. When asked who they were, she answered, the ones who listen when no one else does, the ones who love quiet, the ones Ruth fed. There were no convictions, no court proceedings. The closest thing to justice came from Willard Finch, whose notes, sealed for decades, were unearthed by accident in 1996 during a state records digitization. His final entry reads, "I asked Ruth why. Why the pigs? Why the corners? Why the children? She said, because pigs don't scream like we do, and corners can keep secrets better than walls." He died in 1875, heart failure. But they found his body on the floor, curled into the corner of his study, nails torn from his fingers, mouth open, as if mid-prayer. They buried him next to a church in Athens, Ohio. 2 years later, that church burned down. The only thing left standing? a single wall, with a pig's skull nailed where the altar used to be. There is no official monument in Hellas Edge, no plaque, no state marker. The land where the Geiger house once stood is now an empty patch of woods at the edge of a private cattle farm. The basement still exists beneath the soil, buried, bricked over, and forgotten by nearly everyone. Nearly every spring, without fail, someone leaves a bundle of yarrow and salt tied in burlap near the tree line. Always the same knot, always at dusk. No one admits to it, no one talks about it, but it's there, still. I visited the site myself in November of last year. The trees had gone dry and skeletal, leaves curled like scorched paper. I stood where the trapdoor had once split open, near what we believe was the northeast corner, the one that always filled last. The dirt was soft beneath my boots, and I swear, though maybe it was only in my head, I felt something pulsing just beneath it. A low, steady throb, like the breath of something patient, watching, waiting. I spent my last day in town speaking with a woman named Marlene Baines, the last living descendant of the Reed family, Martha's great-great-niece. Marlene was 93, nearly blind, but her voice was sharp, unforgiving. She had grown up hearing stories about corners, stories she was told never to repeat. I asked her why she agreed to talk to me. She said, because no one believes it anymore. They laugh, or they explain it away, and that's exactly when it comes back, when people stop remembering the truth of it. I asked her what that truth was. She didn't hesitate. That evil doesn't always come with fire and teeth. Sometimes it's careful, patient. Sometimes it prays with you, sits at your table, smiles when you smile, and then it shows you where to put the bones. She died 3 months later, peacefully in her sleep. But when her family cleaned out her home, they found something strange in the root cellar. Each corner had a wooden wedge nailed into it, and one had a single pig tooth tucked beneath. For decades, the state refused to acknowledge what happened in Hellas Edge, but survivors continued pushing. In 2012, an unofficial memorial was erected in the woods by a group of genealogists, historians, and descendants of the missing. It's simple. A stone pillar with 4 carved words, "Remember the forgotten corners." The base is surrounded by children's shoes, left behind by visitors. Some weathered, some new, some too small to have ever been worn. On the day I visited, I saw a tiny handprint in the dirt near the foundation. I thought maybe it was from a raccoon, but there were 5 fingers, pressed deep, and beside it, written in mud, one final message: the floor is still listening. As I sit here now in the quiet, I think about the children no one counted, the ones with no birth records, no graves, the ones who vanished into the silence between walls, into prayers turned poison. And I wonder, how many more Geigers have there been? How many more spiral mouths are carved into beams we'll never uncover? How many basements were built before the blueprints changed? Because the rituals are never gone, they adapt, they hide, sometimes in churches, sometimes in schools, sometimes in the homes of people we admire most, because sometimes the most trusted people are the ones we should have feared most.